To introduce Dr. Chris Milton, and as you would have guessed, this morning is a Jungian morning. Reflecting a little bit earlier on, I've known Chris for a long time. We were both scholars at Rhodes University in 1976 and 7, where we formed the Psychology Society. We did the same PhD coursework, psychotherapy. We were in the same supervision group in Cape Town for 6 years. We both worked at the Tauranga Moana DHB for a few years, and we both work and teach in Auckland now, and we're probably going to see each other for many years. I'll try and tell you a brief little bit about Chris that's not in your handbook. You can read what's there. Chris started medicine in the University of Natal, did a few years, realized he was more psychically oriented than physically or medically. He came to Rhodes University, where he did pharmacy and psychology as a double major, and then later on came back, so he was a practicing pharmacist. Came back to university and did his clinical psychology master's, later did an advanced training in psychotherapy, and he did the PhD coursework psychotherapy, later on did the Jungian training in Cape Town, and as I said, moved to Tauranga Moana, and is now in private practice and teaching as a Jungian analyst in Auckland. Chris has got a very sharp intellect, and he's a great orator, and I advise you to listen carefully because this is going to be complex. I haven't spoken to him about it. It always is. It's about analysis, and it's about his view. So please welcome Dr. Chris Milton.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to present something to you. What more can I say about myself before I jump in? I originally come from, as you heard, from Natal in South Africa. I come from very, very small towns there. I grew up amongst the Zulu people. I have a complex background in terms of my ancestry. I'm like Mary Farrell, I'm a patrilineal Jew, but I have crossed the barriers into that world, which I'm very active in. Now, I'm not sure what more there is for me to tell you about me, given that we've got very little time to do what Mark has rightly described as complicated, because I'm always complicated. But where I will start is I very much liked, it appeals to something in me that we have started some of these with the Waht and ended with them, and I intend to do so. The very first one, I'm going to start with one of my own Waht. The very first one is healing. It is a prayer for healing. I'm going to ask you, if you so wish, to think of those who need healing or yourselves. And after that, I will move on to my paper. And because it is a prayer, I shall appropriately cover my head.
May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Misheberach imotenu mekor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen.
So, to change gears. The part for me to start is with becoming an analyst. And I became an analyst in the normal way, what we think of as the way of becoming an analyst, which is to pass through a tripartite training. You have analysis, you have supervision, you have academic input. But there is another side to training as an analyst. There is another side. And that is becoming a member of a certain community with a history and hearing and imbibing the stories which grow something within you. And there, in that respect, other people, mentors, are very, very, very important. And I was very fortunate in that I was exposed to several remarkable analysts, and two in particular. And I'm a Jungian analyst, but one of these two people was a Freudian analyst, a man who had trained under Anna Freud, had analyzed with Dorothy Burlingham, and who was married, in fact, to another analyst whose father was Charles Brenner, a significant figure in psychoanalysis. Much better known in the USA than in elsewhere, but very significant, said to be the second most read analyst after Freud himself. So that was one person. The other one was a man from London by the name of Barry Proner, who's a Jungian analyst, but of the Kleinian persuasion. So these people were very formative for me, as were a number of other people, some of them not analysts, amongst them Mark Thorpe, who certainly helped foster some interest in unconscious communication. So this provides something of the background of something. And one of the things I noticed, because I'm involved with the training of analysts, is that what is analysis? What is it? Do we all do it? Do some of us do it? When do you do it? Do you do it when you become an analyst? Do people do analysis when they're not analysts? Do all analysts do analysis? Well, the thing is, this is part of my ongoing inquiry about that. And one of the things I want to make really clear is this is drawn from observation. It's drawn from observations of myself when I'm being what I believe to be non-analytic. It is drawn from observations of myself when I believe I am being analytic. It is drawn from observations of others, supervisees usually, or colleagues who are discussing things when I feel they are not being analytic. And it is drawn from the same thing when I felt they have been. And one of the other things I need to make very clear is that there's a whole other debate in here which I'm not going to go near. Which is the debate about, are you doing analysis when containment is the dominant mode of your presence? I'm going to take a slightly more classical view to help us grind our teeth around this. Now, I struggled to think how we might put this together in a way that would come immediately alive, and the best I could come up with was a case study. But there's always a problem with case studies is that there's issues of ethics and so on and so forth. So I have, over the number of years, have got a method of pooling, reworking, imaginatively structuring case material. So I'll present you with a case. This case is true, but it consists of about 4 or 5 people over a very long period, most of them not in this, in fact, I think all of them not in this country. So, but I invite you to try and experience it as a living person. And I'm going to read it because if I don't, I think I will leave some significant things out. Tom was a 35-year-old lawyer who specialized in intellectual property law. He originally started analysis for feelings of inauthenticity, to the extent that he felt he was an imposter. He gave a history of an over-involved, narcissistically extractive, and highly conditional relationship with his mother. He had difficulty maintaining relationships with women, but he had a girlfriend at the time of starting analysis. He rapidly moved to using the couch, and he came 3 times a week on consecutive days. He was knowledgeable about psychoanalysis, especially the theorists such as Winnicott and Kohut. He was inclined to spend about 2/3 of the session narrating what had happened to him in the day or days prior to the session. And this imaginal session I'm presenting would be about a year into the analysis. Tom started the first session of the week by giving an account, a narrative of the intervening period. He felt there was something missing in his life. He spoke in some detail of a social gathering at which he'd felt out of place and obliged to make small talk. He spoke about how his girlfriend had yet again failed to meet his need for being understood. He said he'd reread some Winnicott, and he felt that he lacked a sense of true or authentic self. Now, something's happening in my mind at this moment. I'm tracking this in a particular way. And I wonder, is he making an unconscious communication about me? Is he saying that I have frustrated him? Is he saying that he felt aggressive towards me because of this, but then turned the attack against himself in a defensive way? But I don't say anything. He went on to say that everything he does is worked out consciously and that he felt inauthentic. I reminded us both how he'd felt like this for years and that indeed this was why he'd commenced analysis. And I think to myself, that was unanalytic of me. I've enacted a countertransference. There's no analysis going on there. He then spoke of the tension of the last week and said he decided to break up with his girlfriend. Again, up pops the thought, in silence. Is this an unconscious communication? Does he want to end analysis with me? Am I too impossible to work with? And he goes on to say that his mother had had to move into a nursing home, that she's no longer able to look after herself. He said he was fighting his urge to be the one in the family who organized his mother's move, but was instead leaving it now to his older sister. He had the insight that his girlfriend was very dependent on him, and that he had in a way been facilitating this by being over-supportive of her both emotionally and practically. It took a lot of time to describe how in the past he'd done this in different ways. And then he went on to narrate how he decided to leave his girlfriend and that they'd been arguing about who should be the one to leave the joint apartment and when this should happen and so on. And much of the session, probably the two-thirds, much of the session was spent describing the details of this. And I found myself having fewer and fewer thoughts of the sort I've already described about the relevance of what he said as unconscious communications. I'm listening to him. I am present. He's probably feeling contained, but I don't think we are doing analysis. It was tempting to start to repeat formulatory understanding about his over-involvement with his mother, with women, and his feeling extractively used, and his loss of his authentic sense of self. And it was very tempting to sketch out an understanding of this in terms of his earlier experiences and his patterns of behavior with his mother. But I restrained myself. Like everybody, I don't always. I restrained myself. I restrained the inclination to make this formulation. And then he fell silent. And we both were silent for about 3 minutes. And that's a long time. He asked me to say something and said that maybe I didn't understand him. Very inviting. Oh, so you feel I don't understand you? Instead, I said, I've got nothing to say except your narrative has stopped and we're both faced by a disturbing nothing. He was silent for another 3 minutes or so, and then he reported this dream. My girlfriend's going into hospital for some sort of operation. She's wearing a big green surgical garment that covers most of her body. In the theatre, she and I are investigating the operating table and the drip line. This becomes a broken car. There's a problem with it, and we think the oil level is wrong. I check the dipstick, taking it in and pushing it back in and out, and in and out, and in and out, and in and out, and in and out. And then finally I take it out, and it becomes a strange insect with long feelers. The insect is very frightening. Associating to this, Tom recalled that on waking he'd not remembered the part of the dream about entering the operating theatre and checking the oil. He knew about the girlfriend in the surgical garment, and he remembered the insect, but he didn't remember the bit in between. This had only come back to him in the session when I said that we both faced a disturbing nothing when he was silent. Instead, on waking, his recollection was of going directly from the image of the girlfriend to the insect. He associated further, recalling an occasion when he was a child of his mother going to hospital. I said I thought that the frightening but fragile insect was a missing thing, something taken from his mother, and maybe something he feared would be taken from him for some transgression. I'll repeat that. I said that I thought the frightening but fragile insect was a missing thing, something taken from his mother, and maybe something he feared would be taken from him for some transgression. And you all see that, of course. After a pause, he said that he'd been late in paying tax recently and had been penalized. You see the play. he'd been penalized. He was quiet again after this, and then said he had an image of entering his mother's bedroom to find her there with a lover. He didn't think this had really happened, but the image was very vivid and seemed like a memory. I said that perhaps his entering the room was frightening because forbidden, but maybe it was also frightening because in some ways his mother laid a demand on him to fill something that was a lack in her. Said he'd never quite thought of such a thing. Then he recalled how his mother would dress him up and show him off to friends when he was very little, and how embarrassed this made him feel. Now, it's terribly tempting for me to go into that and start unpacking this. This is what I like to do in some of my supervision sessions, especially when I have some of my supervisees, some particularly brilliant ones, in fact, who present beautiful, verbatim, line-by-line stuff. And it's lovely to go into this and really unpack it. But I'm going to resist that temptation at the moment and just move on to the experience of this, how the session felt as we moved from this beginning phase into a long narrative phase and then into this little period of interaction that has, around the dream, that has so much. So I noticed that we both seem to be in a state of reverie, and we're also comfortable with this strange material. It's what Mate Blanco calls biologic. Things shift back and forth. There's an operating theatre becomes a car, and the dipstick that becomes a frightening insect with long feelers. And Tom, who can be frightened because something is forbidden of him, but also demanded of him. Phenomenologically, I think this is a state of working together that I have come to understand as analysis. This is analysis. But more particularly, it is a state of living encounter with the unconscious. Both of us are encountering the unconscious. The unconscious was first present as a lack, as a disturbing nothing. That is, in the Freudian discourse, the classical Freudian discourse, the lack is the gateway to the unconscious. I don't think it's the only gateway, but it certainly is a significant gateway. The lack is a gateway to the unconscious. And then as strange dream images and shifts, and then as associations and possibly even a screen memory, which is much more of a presence rather than a lack. But before this encounter with the unconscious, we had a period which I do not think was analysis, which was a narrative. In psychotherapy, clients commonly present the therapist with a narrative. This may be something that's remote. Historically, it might be a biographical account. It may be an account of more recent life events. For example, what happened in the last week. And in my experience, this is very common, as I said earlier. It's reasonably comfortable for the therapist to listen to, and it's quite natural for the client to recount, and we can easily form a conspiracy with theory and say this is what we're supposed to be doing. And probably it is, but I don't think it is necessarily analysis. Very often, just to narrate is useful to the client, who thereby has a chance to feel what that they have been heard, and may also allow the client some problem solving as the affect associated with the problem subsides and so on. And I suspect that there is a fairly subtle analytic process occurring inside this narration, but that's another topic. Rather, I'm more interested in the sort of narrative that seems to fill up the room. It is an activity. It fills the session time up. It's like a plug in the gap. It is obstruction to the presence. And it tends to be somewhat experience far. You disconnect. So this sort of narrative often invites the therapist to respond a certain way. To make, as I was invited to make a formulation, to understand what's going on. Beyond, what about beyond? Forget about beyond. The formulation may be fairly short, when we tend to call it an interpretation. I don't really think that is necessarily an interpretation, but that's what we do. And conversely, it might be really long, in which case it's more like a construction or an understanding or something of that sort. But in either event, the formulation refers to a psychological and or interpersonal process without itself being an interpersonal process. So let me just stress that again. The formulation refers to a psychological or interpersonal process without itself being a process. It is focusing on content. It is not focusing on process. And analysis, I'll keep saying this, is about process. It is not significantly about content, although you can't do any process if you don't have some content. So the kind of formulation I'm describing here is, in a sense, an explanation or a construction or a reconstruction, and typically it seems to have psychological depth, but it doesn't. Because For instance, the formulation that a client keeps arriving late because they're self-sabotaging. Put up hands the people who haven't said that. Okay. Seems to be some kind of interpretation. Something's getting into the depths of things. We know that. What does it mean? All it does is make the client feel persecuted. It's not an interpretation of psychological depth. And for the client who likes to be persecuted, because there's a whole lot of dynamics we're not looking at, wonderful. Let's have that. Give me more. Put it on. Also, especially clients who are seeking to grow both personal and general knowledge about the psyche and about psychoanalysis, it's wonderful when you start extending things like that. I've got to hold myself back. I'm a natural didact. Maybe not a good one, but I like to do it. And so, I'll get in there and, abstinence. What's abstinence? Forget about that. But it's nice, you're extending knowledge there. These reasons for acceptance of a formulation are dominantly conscious or pre-conscious. It's not an unconscious thing. At the same time, there's also an acceptance of a formulation because it serves as a type of screen memory. It's displacing. That formulation displaces from the anxious material that needs to be encountered. It could even be a delusion. And it contains truth. But it's truth that through its exaggeration masks the more psychologically important material. Do I need to repeat that? See, if you spend some time with Freud, you'll see he talks about the processes which displace away from the unconscious material. And there are various ways we displace away from the unconscious material. In the session, screen memory is a very good one, a vivid memory that seems to capture something or a dream. They displace us away. And a formulation can serve as a very good displacement away from the material. It contains truth, but it moves us away from a much more immediate truth. Maybe I can let Freud say something here. These recollections have themselves led to nothing further, and it has seemed plausible to regard them as the product of a compromise. The upward drive of the repressed, stirred into activity by the putting forward of the construction, has striven to carry the important memory traces into consciousness. But resistance has succeeded, not, it is true, in stopping that moment, but in displacing it onto adjacent objects of minor significance. So he's just saying, in the original form, or more original form, what I was trying to say now. Formulation can serve to displace you from a more significant truth. Furthermore, we often accept conscious agreement. The client likes the formulation, great, we got it right. But that's absolute agreement or absolute disagreement. Be very, very suspicious. Vague, somewhat, yes, I've heard that before, or an unconscious communication that says you got it right. Trust that a bit more. But don't trust the agreement and don't trust the disagreement. Although sometimes they'll be right. Furthermore, the making of a formulation which is based on a narrative, as I've said, focuses on the content of the client's material. Amongst the many functions this can serve, we need to include the provision of narrative as a form of resistance. There's a lovely little paper by Freud, a 1910 paper on wild analysis. We could all benefit from reading it. Wild analysis is basically a thing we do at social gatherings or about our friends or enemies, where we say he does that because he's got a mother complex. But it focuses on content. And here's what Freud had to say about this. The pathological factor is not his ignorance in itself, which is content, but the root of his ignorance in his inner resistances. It was they that first called this ignorance into being, and they that still maintain it now. So the they there being the forces, the resistance. That is what calls our attention, not what the client is saying. So what is analysis? Well, if we go to the Freudian model, a classical Freudian model, narrative followed by formulation is probably not what he meant. He's got this lovely little definition, and it defines analysis as a process. And I wouldn't, as a Jungian analyst, I would not 100% buy this, but I don't think it's wrong, I just don't think it's sufficient. His definition is as follows. Any line of investigation, a process, which recognizes these two facts, the phenomena of transference and resistance, and takes them as the starting point of its work, has a right to call itself psychoanalysis. Do I need to repeat that? Yes. Okay. Any line of investigation, you could say treatment, any line of investigation which recognizes the two facts of transference and resistance has the right to call itself psychoanalysis. And when you recognize transference and when you recognize resistance, you are committing yourself to working on the process of engaging with them. There's nothing in there about content. There's nothing in there about sexual drives. There's nothing in there about the death drive. It's about a process. And of course, that's an old definition, 1914 in fact. Thomas Ogden does something similar. I'll read his little definition. Perhaps psychoanalysis might be viewed as involving a recognition not only of transference and resistance, but also a recognition of the nature of the intersubjective field within which transference and resistance are generated. Specifically, the creation of a third subject of analysis through which the phenomena of transference and resistance are given symbolic meaning on the analytic stage. I'll read that again. Perhaps psychoanalysis might be viewed as involving a recognition not only of transference and resistance, but also a recognition of the nature of the intersubjective field within which transference and resistance are generated. Specifically, the creation of a third subject of analysis through which the phenomena of transference and resistance are given symbolic meaning on the analytic stage. So now, if I haven't succeeded in confusing you yet, I will try harder. Bion puts the analyst side of this process, of this focus on process in a very tight way when he argues that the analyst must focus neither on what has happened nor on what might happen in the future, but instead observe what is happening now. There goes your narrative. It's what happened in the past. And if you're working with looking for your outcomes, evidence-based outcomes, there goes your future. Bion believed that the analyst will thereby intuit the psychological reality with which he or she needs to be one. With respect to narrative, I'm freely understanding Bion to be referring to narrative here. Bion says, what is known about the patient is of no further consequence. It is either false or irrelevant. And he underlies this by saying that the only point of importance in any session is the unknown. Mark spoke about this yesterday. The only point of importance in any session is the unknown. And if we were to go back a little bit to my case study, what I think we notice, well, we have to because I put it in there, is that he fell silent and we were both silent for about 3 minutes. He asked me to say something and said that maybe I didn't understand him. I said that I had nothing to say except that his narrative had stopped, and we both faced a disturbing nothing. We both faced a disturbing nothing. The only point of importance in any session is the unknown. What then does analysis practically comprise of? At least from the psychoanalytic perspective, classically this starts with a fundamental rule, which when obstructed by transference and resistance, provides a point at which to interpret the motives for that resistance. Do I need to recap the fundamental rule here? You come in, you lie down, and you say whatever comes to mind. And what happens? People can't do it. You can't do it. It's very hard to do. If you do it too well, it's a problem. If you do it too well, must be a resistance. Actually, you're probably looking at anal obsessive character verbal diarrhea. That's another way of blocking. Here I'm focusing on content, but even transference discloses a gap. Generally, the Freudian perspective looks at gaps, forgettings, slips, stoppings, obstructions, and even transference is a gap. It's a gap between who the person really is and who you believe them to be. So there's a gap. And I think that it's a seminal insight of Freud's that the prospect of filling the gap, of making the unconscious conscious, generates terrible psychological discomfort. It could be dread, it could be shame, it could be anxiety, it could be guilt, or some other unbearable emotion. I want to say something here for a moment. I'm talking about clients who come for and are suitable for analysis. I have very serious reservations about applying anything like this to someone with a fundamentally regressed or undeveloped personality, some borderline clients. When you go thumping through, or we go, I've done this before, fortunately a long time ago, you go thumping through somebody's very fragilely constructed ego, you just get a big mess, and you put them into the most terrible states. I'm not talking about those kind of clients. I'm not saying we're going there. And the other worry that I started to generate as I'm talking about this is, maybe this sounds a bit too intrapsychic, because I'm seeing psychoanalysis as a facilitation of an encounter with the unconscious. That's my definition. Psychoanalysis is a facilitation of an encounter with the unconscious. And I'm figure and grounding that. The thing that's often the figure is narrative and formulation. Narrative and formulation. That's often the figure. And in the ground, we have something else. Now I'm going to pull the ground forward. The ground that comes forward is outpicturing of the unconscious and encounter with it. I repeat, outpicturing of the unconscious and encounter with it. And that, I think, is the process of analysis. Outpicturing of unconscious and encounter with it. It doesn't have to be an interpretive encounter. There are many ways to encounter the unconscious. And it doesn't have to, I believe, be outpictured as lack, but it can be. The word outpicture is Donald Kalshed's. He's a Jungian analyst, particularly interested in trauma. And outpicturing obviously doesn't only mean presenting a lack. It can mean presenting a lack. I think Freud, to some extent at least, described the outpicturing of the unconscious as a lack. Jung mostly didn't. In Jung's studies of the word association experiment in the very early years, he does, because it's interruptions of your activity which signal the presence of a complex. But as he gets going beyond that time, which is the early part of the 20th century, it's much more presence. And in his own encounter with the unconscious, which he actually calls confrontation with the unconscious, it's images, it's dreams, it's play activity, it's painting, it's writing, it's visions. It's very, very much a presence. But Jung understood that the unconscious was quite other to the conscious attitude. He understood that an encounter between consciousness and the unconscious, there needs to be something that would change. In short, he felt that the presence of the unconscious is not ultimately something that can simply be translated into consciousness. You can't simply translate the unconscious into consciousness, which was part of the idea that's present in Freud's interpretation of dreams. That through, you hear the manifest material, you back translate it through understanding displacement, condensation, symbolization, secondary revision. You back translate it into the latent, understand the resistances, take care of it and present it to the client. There's a translative process. Jung didn't see that as the way. He thought that there was something so utterly foreign about the unconscious that something had to change in consciousness to make space for it. And this is a piece of work. This is part of what the work is of analysis. And this is why it's an encounter with the unconscious, not a presentation to. And in Jung's thinking, too, the ego resists the encounter with the unconscious because it threatens change. It threatens change to the ego, and that brings discomfort. So, too, in Jungian thinking, analysis becomes the facilitation of an encounter with the unconscious by a process of first permitting the emergence of unconscious material and then helping to loosen the grip of that psychological discomfort. And that allows the beginning of the natural working of integration to occur. So, to repeat my definition, analysis is a facilitated process of consciousness encountering the outpictured unconscious. And while this process may rest on narrative, it is not narrative. And whilst it may draw on formulation, it is not formulation. And furthermore, practically, it's natural for a therapist to translate narrative into formulation. There's also a satisfaction, even a containment, for both client and, lost my page here, and therapist to share such formulations. The practice of the client providing a narrative, and either or both the client and the therapist making a formulation or an understanding, seems to have its uses. But my own experience is that when narrative and formulation preponderate, the process tends not to be one that I recognize as analysis, that my ancestors have helped me understand to be analysis. It lacks what I can only describe as the ambiance of analysis. I've also noticed that these formulations tend to be repetitive. The client brings a new narrative, and we continually reinterpret it in terms of an established formulation. And such a client may be gratified when either they themselves or the therapist discovers something new. You go off to a conference, you listen to X, Y, and Z, and you've got these wonderful new ideas, you bring it in and you feed it in, or a good, particularly juicy supervision session, a new idea pops up, and, oh, great, what a great, this is wonderful. It's gratifying, it might be accurate, but there's a risk it's not. It seems that novelty, elegance, plausibility are significant criteria that clients and ourselves use to judge and value the validity of a formulation. And one way to achieve novelty, when all else fails, change therapists. However, in terms of both Freud and Jung's thinking, narratives followed by formulation do not make the unconscious available to consciousness. In fact, the narrative may well mix with the resistance and so obscure the fragments of the unconscious that present themselves. The formulation may also take on a function congruent with the client's psychodynamics. And typically that's things like internal judgment, most typically. If you can say something that's in the slightest way sounds critical, self-reflective, self-critical, very fine line, will be well received. Now, I'm going to stop here, mostly because I got to the end of this page. And also because I think that I've essentially put my point, and I'm hoping that it's stimulated some thought in you, even more hoping that you'll grow some ideas in me in the next while that we talk together. So, there we are. Over to you. Okay. So I've either stunned you or managed to produce the perfect analytic situation. Sorry?
Your narrative has ended and we're facing a nothing.
Yes.
Chris, what do you think of the art therapies and any of these kinds of expressive therapies like Jung used to do, but are other means of expressing the unexpressible?
Well, thank you very much, Lee. I think you put your finger right on something which I referred to, but probably not in an expansive way, which is that the unconscious, whilst the Freudians classically significantly noticed the lack, Jung and the Jungians noticed the presence. And I think what you're highlighting is the value of the presence. In that expressive therapies, whatever they might be, whatever form they take, whether it be art therapy or sand play, clay sculpture therapy, even dance and so on, these expressive therapies, I think, have the potential to bring the unconscious forward so that we can encounter it. I think one of the big temptations, however, as it is always when you have content, is the temptation to get so hooked into the content at a level that we match with our already existent ego attitude, well, the capacities that we already have, that the challenge of it is not as present as it could be. This is not to say that the practitioners of this sort don't do that. I'm just saying that's a particular difficulty, because the material is very rich, the content can spark off all sorts of things. You dig a big hole in your sand play, and immediately someone's thinking of course, one doesn't interpret in sand play, but you're immediately thinking, this is Persephone going into the underground, and so on and so forth. But what's the experience of being down the hole? That's the difference. So where the expressive therapy pulls forth the experience of being down the hole in the black place, where no growth takes place, and you've got to pick a few pomegranate seeds just to survive, where that experience gets you, and where the therapist can help facilitate getting in touch with that experience and the agonies and the anxieties and the joys even of experiencing that help the ego attitude start to transform, there I think one's doing the work. But when it's just a kind of presentation, it's not. Now, one of the places where I've experienced this a long, long time ago was when people are artists and they bring their artwork to therapy or analysis. Very tricky. A lot better, if you're going to have art, to have someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Because then you've got a better chance of it being stuff from the unconscious. But even then, there's a challenge. There's a challenge. Have I answered or responded properly to your question or your comment?
I really like that. And could I ask a further question about the layers of the psyche that are not in, there is no language. You know, the deeper levels are not in language and they can't be expressed through language. And what you, yeah, I'm just curious, do you tell anybody about that?
So now you're going into the bits I didn't write about, because that's too much. Yes, well, that's a great thing. You see, I mean, you're quite right. There are a number of theorists, and we all know this, and there are a number of theorists who've spoken about the languages which are not language, or before language. There, you know, in the Kleinian world, there's Henry Ray. Andre Green talks about thing representations as opposed to word representations. Winnicott talking about a pre-analysis, and just so containment is the main thing. And then in the deep, deep levels of the unconscious, as you point out, you might encounter phenomena that just are beyond wording. They're beyond wording. So I think one of the first ways in which we're open to those is, because bear in mind our task is to bring them into the world, I think one of the first ways we encounter that level is in the body. And so it's really important to be open to where the body is. And I think there's a way of, instead of interpreting, presencing. So where you use your body to presence something. And it can be quite a, I've spoken of this before. I worked for a 7-year period with a man who, no, sorry, yes, 7-year period, seven-year period with a man who gave me lots of material and we didn't get anywhere. But he kept coming. And then there was a day when a couple of words went past, and I suddenly felt a tear, just a little tear. And I felt my tear go disappear. I thought, whoa, what's going on here? So I sat forward and I thought, next time I see that, I'm going to grab hold of it. I don't know how you grab hold of it, something to do with the breathing or something. And then another little tear came and I held it. And it's trying to get away and I hold. And then in the body, somehow I put my hand forward and spoke. The words I can't get now, I've got them somewhere. And in that moment, the tear moves from me to him. And he is weeping. And we have another 3 years of highly productive analysis. No interpretation occurred there. But what happened? The unconscious was outpictured. But it was facilitated, it was outpictured through my bodily response, which I had to work to. Now, if I made some smart interpretation about your anal fixation, inability in using, what do we call it, isolation of affect, we'd still be talking now if we were in the same city. But because it wasn't interpreted, because it wasn't in words, it worked. So I think, I'm sure other people could say a lot more than I'm saying about this, but this is my take, is the body is very, very important when trying to grasp certain levels of things. And I haven't addressed that in here because I've held on to early Freud very tightly, mostly to keep focused, because if you don't, we would have been here all day. So that's that. There's someone behind you, Farad, I'm sure.
Hi, Chris. My name is Graj. What is psychoanalysis for? So why are you doing this? What's the kind of the process of? Is there a process of change?
Very good question. I think the people who would answer that question best are the people who come for it, who come for analysis. I think it does lots of different things. I think there are many benefits, and sometimes there are no benefits. I think there are many benefits. I think one of the things it does is it does sometimes simply address symptoms. Sometimes it does lead to symptom relief. And I think that was the original intention of it. to a large extent, obviously, was to relieve symptom. Sometimes it relieves symptom. Sometimes it leads to somebody feeling more alive. I think that's very important. Sometimes people use it as a kind of life discipline. And I think it starts as a life discipline to promote their psychological development. And my increasing experience is that is becoming a discipline to develop themselves spiritually. But many years may happen. So I think it's many things. Sometimes it's just a preparation to train other people to do the same thing. And that's a bit circular, isn't it? It is a unique experience, or a special experience. I won't say unique. It's a very special experience. There's something very special, and it's a place where something happens that doesn't happen anywhere else. It's a way of making things, of helping things happen that don't happen anywhere else. I don't know if I'm adequately answering your question, but very difficult to have an evidence base for. But is it of value? I think people would stop coming if it wasn't. Farad, you had a comment or question?
Thanks for a lovely talk.
Thank you.
Two strange questions. You asked the question, what is analysis?
Yes.
And one of your answers is it's a living encounter with the unconscious.
Yes.
It seems to me a strange word to use, analysis. A living encounter with unconscious. Is there another word that might be more appropriate for what you're describing? And I wonder if you use the word analysis because you're a psychoanalyst, so you're then looking to find... Yes. But if you start with a living encounter with unconscious, another word might be more appropriate because the connotations of the word analysis, analytic, that kind of thing. So that's one bit.
Yes.
Second bit is when you ask... you gave a definition of psychoanalysis as a facilitation of an encounter with the unconscious. Now, you've spoken about the unconscious.
Yes.
So my second question is, where is it? What is it? Is it something that's in the patient, or is it something that, if you like, both analyst and patient are immersed in? Where is the unconscious in the way you speak of it?
Thank you for both of those. I want to take the second one first, because I think it's the more relevant one. My speaking of the unconscious is a reification of unconsciousness. And I've used it dominantly because it gets really very difficult in writing a paper to talk about unconsciousness. So it's a reification. I don't think that it's located in something called the psyche. I think it is it is psychological life that has not yet been thematized. It is psychological life is the capacity to live psychologically that has not yet found the best thematic expression in the world. So the unconscious, actually not a good way of putting it. And I have reified it there, but it's for stylistic reasons. But it does lead on quite correctly to your question. Does that go somewhere towards addressing it? Partly. Shall I move to the first one, or shall we talk a bit?
Go ahead.
The second question, the first question also, I think, hugely relevant, because the connotations of analysis have taken a particular shape in the world over the years. So this is what happens with words, is they take on a particular shape, and then what they mean to us now and what they may have meant don't hold water anymore. I'll give you an idea, a sense of how these sort of things happen by looking at a totally different linguistic phenomenon. I understand, I'm not sure I will record the word correctly, that in Dutch, the word for rice, journey, and giant is basically the same word. In Afrikaans, which is derived from Dutch, the word for rice is reis, the word for journey is reis, and the word for giant is reus. And you can see there that how language morphs. And I think that analysis, the word analysis has morphed, because the word analysis comes from the Greek that means to untie a knot, analutine, to remove, to unknot something. So for me, I've got a bit of an affectionate attachment to analysis, but as you rightly say, I am an analyst, so that would do it. There probably are probably ultimately better words we could now use in the contemporary world. I don't think anybody soon is going to make a new word and it's going to run. It's like the attempt to change projective identification as a word, as a descriptor, being something that just never took. We can talk about communication by impact or counter response or whatever. It just hasn't worked. I think there's a kind of symbolic density to the word. We're attached to it, and I think it'll carry on. So what I prefer to do is to try and remind myself that it's not a cutting process. It is a process of loosening. Does that go somewhere? Have you another word, maybe?
Well, it's a kind of meaning-making activity that you're engaged in, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very impressive talk. I was very interested in the tear. And I was wondering, in the analytic situation where there is no response and one's waiting in that crucial edge, and the tear flows and the patient responds, to what extent is he, quote, pleasing you, or to what extent has the unconscious been contacted? And the question is, who's unconscious? Is it a shared thing at that point? And if so, does that continue for other sessions?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, to which there's no answer. But what it does do, what it highlights, is it highlights, again, what Mark was speaking of yesterday, which is that in our activity, we constantly have to face not knowing and the unknown. And the analyst has to face not knowing and the unknown as well. And we need to do that in a disciplined way. So to ask the question, is the client gratifying me, is a very good question. To automatically assume that he either is, or she either is or isn't, is going towards certainty. So we need to work, and we continually workshop our ways of finding our way where we don't know. We've got some clues, some ways to do it. When it's very verbal, we can try and use unconscious communications. We can use our own dreaming process. We can use supervision. But there's no ultimate answer. But to be alert to that, to ask the question that you ask, I think is the first important thing. The second part of it, is there a place where our unconsciouses merge? I think yes, there is a place where our unconsciouses merge. And that too is a huge topic. But again, we are reifying the unconscious here.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you for this talk, because it made me revalue the depth of that journey that you describe, to a real encounter with the unknown and unknowable, and that is such an amazing journey. And it sort of takes away all my criticism, not takes away, it makes me understand all my criticism towards the analytical approach, which can be so persecutory and so on and so on. It's almost like you purified it for me and made it very clear.
That's good to hear. That's very good to hear. Thank you. Judith, there's somebody right back there.
Kia ora, Chris. Thank you very much for an incredibly compact and dense presentation. It's very full.
Thank me for that.
I do have a little bit of a challenge for you in terms of the compactness and density of your presentation this morning. And if you're able to, what I'd love to hear is some of your thoughts about who you are and what you do and your relationship to this house.
So, I mean, that's a big question, that. that is, in a sense, off the topic of this. Might take you into an encounter with my unconscious, or not so unconscious. Many years ago, when I was studying at Rhodes University, in the time I was studying to be a pharmacy student, in fact, I was very, very friendly with a number of guys who were studying theology, were going to become Anglican or Methodist or Presbyterian ministers. And I used to tag along with them to all sorts of things. I went to biblical study the biblical studies lectures and theology lectures, and I also tagged along with them to when they gave their first trial sermons. This is a beautifully bit of kind of wonderful discordance, a paradox, which I enjoy. I enjoy the paradox. I'm not Christian, but I would go along with these guys. And on one occasion, we went to a very small rural church, which was run by people who, under the apartheid system, would have been classified as coloured. And we were sitting there, and one of the things I noticed, which was significantly different to all the white churches we'd been in, was that as they were doing their thing, these people would periodically go, Amen, Amen. Likewise, when I was a child, I can remember going to what's called a ndaba, which would be it's a Zulu event, which Maori would be a hui, ndaba. I remember going to ndaba. Children not normally at ndaba, but I was there. It was on a farm. It had to do with some labour issues, I think, and my father was there with a friend of his, and that we were sitting in the background. So the old man talks, you see, and the other old people sitting there smoking their pipes go, yabo, yabo, as the discussion goes on. Now, where do I experience this? Well, where I experience this, and I'll say something later on about this, I hope, in the panel discussion. I experienced this in traditional or semi-traditional synagogue. There's interaction between the speaker and the spoken to. We're all in discussion with each other. And this is not my first time on a marae. It's the first time on this one, and the first time on one anything looks as magnificent as this one. But the atmosphere is there. The atmosphere is there of Amen, of Yebo, of people speaking together, no matter who it is that stands up here. And that's part of my experience that meshes with my own cultural roots, and which is pleasant, enjoyable, it's familiar, it's known. But at the same time, it's so utterly different. So, it's a challenge. There are challenges as well. Although I'm not observant in this regard, think of this. We walk out at the end of the porphyry, and we hungi. And you know what? I am doing that with a number of women who are of childbearing age. They might be menstruating. Now, if I was traditionally observant, you've just put me into the most incredible situation, because to touch such a person means I have to go and immerse myself in running water. So, well, that's not true for me. I'm not traditionally observant in that sense. But you see that there's also the place where there's attention. There's great otherness and there's great sameness. So I find this as a place of encountering the unknown, just as I've spoken of in my talk. It's where I myself will encounter something of the unconscious. So Margaret, if you're still there somewhere, I hope that addresses something of what you were saying or asking.
Thank you very much for that lovely talk that you've just given. And I think for me, you've really deepened my respect for Freud. And I think what did that was your the way you expressed the special moment and being in the presence of that special moment. And I think my question is in that special moment, do you have a name for that? And is that what Jung would refer to as the numinous?
That's a very good question. I don't have a special name for it. Maybe it deserves a special name. Maybe someone can give it a special name. Now, your question of the numinous, I'm going to answer that by a story. As some of you may know, maybe all of you know, Freud was a collector of antiquities. And in the evenings, when he obtained a particularly nice new antiquity, he would take it into dinner with him. And he'd place it on his table, on the dining table in front of him. And he would look at it, and he would be attuned to it. And when asked to describe what was the experience of having this object in front of him at the table, he described it as erquickung. You can hear the English word quick in there. Erquickung. I'm not a German speaker, but I understand that this would mean something like enlivening. So Freud was encountering the unconscious in that figure that stood on the table. And I think Jung would have used the word numinous. So when the unconscious is encountered, there's generally some quality of numinosity. The thing is that I think that it sometimes gets lost in the anxiety. So we might not be aware of it. And to come back to what Lee was saying, I think that's one of the things that can happen in the more expressive therapies, is that the capacity to hear the numinous is a little louder. Whereas in these verbal therapies, the capacity to hear the anxiety is a little louder. I'm really using the wrong metaphors here, being loud and so on, but still, that's what I think might happen. But have I a name for the moment? No. Does somebody else? I don't know. Should we have? Probably. You know, when are we doing analysis? Now, what I've tried to do is to focus on my understanding of what is an analytic moment or an analytic phase. What I've not done is spoken about the people who do that. I think one of the things that I've particularly struggled to develop over the last several years of being involved in the training of Jungian analysts is a very particularly important thing, which is this, that the person you're training needs to become the analyst that they already are, not the analyst that you are, the analyst that they already are. And you see, when you take out the red book and you go, poops, or whatever, you are doing analysis. You're not doing analysis a la Chris Milton, but you're doing analysis, because it's not as if I'm not the definer of analysis, Freud is not the definer of analysis in that sense. The person's practice is not. Of course, we have constraints within which we construct a dialogue and that's where questions of frame and so on and technique come into it. It's not as if we're without those, because that's a place of the dialogue, but you may come out of that dialogue with some radically different ideas about how you do things. And that makes you the analyst that you are. Some of that may run counter to your society, it may run counter to what your code of ethics says even. But I think if you have got there through an honest process, you're likely to be doing the right thing, and if it's about facilitating an encounter with the unconscious, you're likely to be doing analysis.
Kia ora.
Thank you.
Kia ora, Chris. I'm over here. I'll stand. Chris, I also had a comment question. I was thinking about Margaret's question, Farad's question, and your comment, Joy. And I just wanted to say, I'm not so sure we're a young country in the way that we often think about it. And in relation to Margaret's question, I was thinking about the healers and the tohunga downstairs. And my experience with them is that they are very much facilitating an encounter with the unconscious. And it's not called analysis. And it has a long and deep history in this country. Just wondered if you'd care to comment.
No, thank you very much, John. I think that's quite a really interesting, important point that you make there. I think that humankind has been encountering the unconscious forever. It's something that's what we do. I think it's part of what, being human. We've had different ways of facilitating it. Healing is a very good word, because healing comes from heal, which is to make whole, to make complete. And that, I think, does touch on exactly what we're trying to do. Maybe this goes more towards the question of why should people come for analysis, to become more whole, to become more complete. And I think that there are traditions which have been analytic in that sense forever. And I think it's very good to hear you focusing on the age of the country, because I think that what Joy's talking about is a particular group within the community, a group whose memory of being here is much shorter. Yes. No, I get that, Joy. I get that. It's a group whose memory is much shorter, and they do present a very particular challenge. That group present a very particular challenge. But I think equally Margaret and John are highlighting something of a much greater. In South Africa, there was quite a lot of work done by one of the people that was one of my original teachers, Vera Bierman, which is the work with traditional healers, and she showed much of the shamanic processes, and in fact the training to become a shamanic practitioner in Southern Africa were very, very similar to the processes we go through in training to be analysts. A little bit tougher in that you often had to go and take an emetic in the morning and sort of vomit on the side of the river and so on. Most of us wouldn't put up with that. But certainly there's a trial and an acquisition of a deep connection to the unconscious through the process of learning to be a healer. There was someone else.
Thanks, Chris. I'm finding myself staying with not knowing about the word outpicturing. When I read it in the descriptions you talk, my intellect understands it, but it's still now I don't get it, or I do. It gets me.
Yes. Well, I can see we're going to have to stop. But what I would say is, it's a word I chose. It's somebody else's word. It's not an ideal word because it's not always pictures that we're looking at. I think it tries to respect the more chthonic level of our experience and so on. And there might well be a better word, and I haven't found it yet. But I could agree that this is a problematic word. But what it essentially means is the way in which the unconscious makes itself present. That's my short version for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, though.
One more short association.
Andrew.
Thanks. It's always good to break the rules. It's a comment rather than association. I think in a way you answered it at the end, but you talked to many things about what analysis is for. Yes. And by the way, I wanted to say I did love your focus on the unconscious and the meeting of. But I was thinking you weren't saying much about for the development of the person. And you said it at the end about becoming whole.
Yes.
But I wondered about you not using that before.
Well, I think that's really interesting, Andrew, because basically Jungian analysis is about individuation, which is becoming the person that you really are. So what an interesting unconscious slip of mine to not have said that. In a way, what you've just presented, what you've just encountered me with, facilitated my encounter with, is the one thing that this is really all about, which I think is a wonderful place for us to have come to. So thank you. It's in the lack.
Yeah, Chris, is this working? A very warm thank you for your presentation. And I think for opening the unknown and the uncertainty, inviting us in, and for being in the present with the audience instead of only a theoretical thing. It was a very dense, intelligent, theoretical conversation and a lot of comments. So I think the best thing I could do is read out 3 comments that we heard here. Your talk purified my understanding of psychoanalysis. Your talk deepened my respect for Freud. And your talk relieved me of my own work, and I realized I had an analysis. So thank you very much for that. It was really great. On behalf of the NZAP, please accept this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm not sure at which point I do my last Waht. Would that be now?
Well, I think we, yes.
Okay,
if you'd like to do it, we'll go with it.
Great. I would like to ask those, I'll put this down so it doesn't obstruct my diaphragm. I'd like to ask those who know what I do now, if you feel like it, to do it with me. You'll know it. Even those for whom this is faint. It means, let me do a good translation. I always do this badly. Behold how good and how pleasing if people could sit together in unity.
הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד.
Thank you very much.